All right, welcome into another FanDuel Hurry Up. I'm Joe Ranieri, joined alongside Jim Sonos of numberFire. We had an opportunity yesterday to talk about some of the winners so far in the NFL free agency period. Today, we're going to tackle some of the losers. And Jim, the NFL is open for business, and thank goodness for that. But the deals, they just keep coming in hard. They keep coming in fast.
Yeah, it really has. And it's been interesting to follow everything. It's kind of hard to keep up because there's just so much happening right now. So a lot of winners, a lot of losers. We could have done a full another day, I think, of free agency winners based on the stuff that happened yesterday. But still, some guys who are definitely impacted in a negative way that we'll get to for today.
All right, Jim, let's start with the Minnesota Vikings and their quarterback, Kirk Cousins, who just signed a 2-year extension with the club. What are your thoughts about Kirk Cousins and the Minnesota Vikings and that extension? I'm sure Kirk Cousins feels good about it.
Yeah, I think the extension is fine. My issue is that they traded Stephon Diggs because from a fantasy perspective, the big reason Kirk Cousins was relevant in fantasy was because he was efficient. He was in a really good system, in a really good situation up in Minnesota. He doesn't run a whole lot. He doesn't throw a ton. That's what you need, is to be efficient in fantasy if you're not going to run or have a lot of volume. And now the expected efficiency for Kirk Cousins should go down now that Stephon Diggs is elsewhere. The Vikings do have 2 first-round picks, 22 and 25, thanks to that trade via the Buffalo Bills, but that's not going to replace Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs is one of the best route runners in all of the NFL, and he is a true difference maker on the field. And now it's Adam Thielen and then a massive cliff to the rest of the wide receivers on this Vikings team. There is still plenty of time for them to address that, but the free agency market is drying up. As mentioned, you can plug in a rookie, but it's hard to expect a rookie to replace the production lost by Stephon Diggs. So I'm a bit worried here about Kirk Cousins from a fantasy perspective. I think the extension was fine by the Vikings, but it's kind of confusing to extend Cousins and then dish away one of his best assets in Stephon Diggs. I think that Adam Thielen was a winner, as we discussed yesterday, but this does not help Kirk Cousins. He is an efficiency-dependent quarterback in fantasy football, and his efficiency should go down with no Stephon Diggs. So I think if we're talking about one quarterback leagues, it's going to be pretty hard for me to get jazzed about Kirk Cousins for 2020.
Well, I got a couple of words there for Minnesota Viking fans, and it's Dalvin Cook, who is going to be a key piece to this offense and to this team moving forward. As Dalvin Cook will go, this team will go. So it'll be very interesting to see his health this year as well as the upcoming draft for the Minnesota Vikings. All right, let's move on to the Houston Texans and their quarterback. How about Deshaun Watson? I'm not sure there is maybe a more depressed quarterback in the league right now as he watched DeAndre Hopkins walk out the door, going to be wearing a new uniform next year. Where do you stand right now on Deshaun Watson and the Houston Texans heading into this year?
Yeah, at least with the Vikings, they have 2 first-round picks to try to fill that hole. The Houston Texans do not have a first-round pick because they traded that away to get Laramie Tunsil over the offseason. So the task of replacing DeAndre Hopkins is already immensely difficult, and it gets a whole lot worse when you don't have a first-round pick to do so. Now, they do have 2 seconds, thanks to this trade, but asking a second-round rookie to replace DeAndre Hopkins is a super major task. That's going to be a tough order for them there. Now, the good thing that Deshaun Watson has that Kirk Cousins does not have is that he does have a couple of really talented wide receivers there with Will Fuller and with Kenny Stills. Those 2 guys are both really good. We also know that they are injury risks, and that is going to be a perpetual concern for this Texans team. Deshaun Watson is a really good quarterback. He does add value as a rusher, which is great for fantasy as well. But you have to question if that efficiency will go down with DeAndre Hopkins being gone. Hopkins has been a staple in the lineup ever since Deshaun Watson joined this team. He does not miss games. So we don't know what to expect out of Deshaun Watson with no DeAndre Hopkins. But in the past, when he's lost Will Fuller, we've seen the efficiency go down for Deshaun Watson. And I would expect the same to happen here. Now, this is not to say that Deshaun Watson is not fantasy relevant. His outlook is still much better than that of a lot of quarterbacks in the league, but it definitely does take him down a couple of pegs. And with Deshaun Watson going pretty high in fantasy drafts, that's going to be a harder pill to swallow now than it was previously. In general, we do want to wait on quarterback in fantasy football, and I think that if you're going to take that plunge early, I think that Deshaun Watson should go down our list now. We should be less willing to make that leap to get him than we would have been previously. So I still like Deshaun Watson. I think he is a tremendous football player, but from a fantasy perspective and where he's currently going from a cost perspective, it's a lot easier to get there now that he does not have one of the league's top wide receivers.
Well, let's face it, right? The running game is going to be extremely important this year for the Houston Texans. Can they get those early returns on David Johnson? That is going to speak volumes, I think, as to the kind of year the Houston Texans are going to have. All right, so let's talk about Julian Edelman now and the New England Patriots, who, let's face it, he's only known one quarterback, and that quarterback is no longer there. Tom Brady on his way to the Tampa Bay Bucks, and Julian Edelman has got to be sitting there going, now what? And it's a great question, Jim. Now what with the New England Patriots and Julian Edelman?
I think the one good thing for Edelman is that there are still a lot of viable quarterbacks out there who could fill this void. So it's not as if I wouldn't expect Jarrett Stidham to start. If Jarrett Stidham did start for the Patriots, Julian Edelman would be completely irrelevant for fantasy, but we should see some viable replacement come in there at some point. The problem is that, like, Tom Brady himself wasn't that bad last year. I think the issue with Brady was that he had a really bad supporting cast, so expecting good efficiency out of him was a pretty tall ask. And so you go from Tom Brady, who was relatively good and decently efficient, to now whatever the Patriots are going to have, it is going to be a quarterback downgrade for Edelman. As you mentioned, too, he's built up this chemistry with Tom Brady for such a long time. Now that's gone. That chemistry is gone. He will have a new quarterback for the first time in his entire career. That is definitely a bad thing as well. The third thing that's a negative for Edelman is that they're going to improve the talent around him. You have to assume that even with Tom Brady being gone, unless the Patriots go full tank, which their moves thus far indicate that's not the plan, you'd have to assume that it's going to be an improved supporting cast around Edelman this year. If that takes away targets from Edelman, that takes away his one remaining really positive strength from a fantasy perspective was all that volume. Now, that volume should go down, the efficiency should go down, the chemistry of the quarterback should go down. There are a lot of negatives here for Edelman. Now, if they were to sign or trade for a relevant quarterback, maybe this isn't as bad as it seems at first glance. But as of right now, I'm going to downgrade Edelman quite a bit. He is still viable for fantasy because I would still expect him to get a good number of targets, but we have to expect a lot less than what we've seen from Edelman over the past couple of years.
Two words to keep an eye on in New England: Cam Newton. It would not be the first time that Bill Belichick and company went ahead, got themselves a aging veteran and gave them new life. Would not surprise me at all, but it is going to be very interesting to watch what Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniel decide to do with that quarterback position, especially in the draft next month. So let's talk about one of the game's truly greats, both on and off the field. Larry Fitzgerald, the Arizona Cardinals. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody say a bad thing about Larry Fitzgerald. The way he conducts his business is amazing. And now all of a sudden, Kyler Murray's got DeAndre Hopkins, and he still has Larry Fitzgerald. Larry Fitzgerald should be really happy about this move, should he not?
I'm sure he's excited if you're talking about winning games, because DeAndre Hopkins will help this Cardinals team win football games. He'll help Kyler Murray get better, but he's not going to help Larry Fitzgerald get volume. And that's what we're looking at here in fantasy football is we want volume, and Fitz is not going to get it with DeAndre Hopkins being in town. I think that Christian Kirk is still a pretty viable wide receiver in fantasy, even with Hopkins being there, because he's young, he's very good, he had a rapport with Kyler Murray last year. So I think Kirk is still okay, and he may see softer coverage as well. But as far as Larry Fitzgerald goes, he is hyper volume dependent because he's not getting downfield, he's not making these huge catches, not expecting huge touchdown totals out of him. So kind of like Edelman, what you need for Fitzgerald is a lot of targets. When you bring in a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, he's going to command a heavy target share within this offense. And that's going to take away some targets, and probably a lot of targets, from Larry Fitzgerald. They also could address this position in the draft because they do still have that first round pick as well. So we've already seen Fitzgerald get downgraded as of right now with Hopkins being in town. But if they were to add more via the draft, which they very well could, given how good this draft class is, he could become completely irrelevant. So he had 20% of the targets last year with Christian Kirk being healthy. I would not expect that number to be anywhere near that for this year. Fitzgerald is a tremendous football player. He is a Hall of Famer for sure. But from a fantasy perspective for 2020, I don't see it, given all the volume he is losing with DeAndre Hopkins now in town.
So let's be realistic, though. That is one heck of a security blanket to have if I'm Kyler Murray, knowing that I get to dump it off and I get to find Larry Fitzgerald when all things aren't going my way. So to your point, though, probably great news for the team, but maybe the addition of DeAndre Hopkins, not great news for Larry Fitzgerald for fantasy purposes. I want to talk about recency bias, too, if I can, for a second, because it's a liability in the sports betting world, and I do think it's also a liability in the fantasy world, because I don't know anybody who fans are going to look at and just put them up on a pedestal like Raheem Mostert of the 49ers, who had an amazing run at the end of the season, right through the Super Bowl there. So I know fans are going to get into this year, and they're going to be looking at Raheem Mostert and saying, boy, oh boy, this guy's going to be even better than he was last year. Is there some liability in thinking that way about Raheem Mostert moving into this year?
Yeah, I think we knew going into this year that Raheem Mostert was not going to be some bell cow back for the 49ers, because they've always used this running back rotation, whether it be Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, Mostert all mixing in. So I think our expectations were pretty realistic in keeping them in check for Mostert. But they kind of got the worst case scenario yesterday based on the news that went down. The first thing was that Matt Breida, they put a second round tender on Matt Breida. I don't think anyone's giving up a second round pick to get Matt Breida on their team, so he should be back with them next year. Then they restructured the contract of Jerick McKinnon. We've kind of forgotten about Jerick McKinnon because he's missed the past 2 years, but by restructuring that contract, Jerick McKinnon basically ensures he will be with that team in 2020. So what we're seeing right now for the 49ers is they have 4 viable running backs between Raheem Mostert, Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, and Jerick McKinnon. That could always change because McKinnon, we've seen him deal with injuries. Matt Breida, always banged up. Tevin Coleman dealt with injuries last year too. But there are a lot of bodies here, and this is a team that likes to utilize all of those bodies. It's also not as if Raheem Mostert is super young. This is going to be his age 28th season, so he's a little bit up there in age. Doesn't have a ton of wear on those tires by any mean, but still, he's not a spring chicken. So there are 4 guys here on the San Francisco backfield. We know that they like to use a committee, and Mostert is not exactly the youngest guy in the world. That all adds up to keep expectations in check. So I think that as a community, the fantasy football world has done a good job of realizing the limitations around Raheem Mostert so far, but given the return of McKinnon and that Breida will be there as well, I think this kind of wound up being a worst-case scenario for Raheem Mostert. So if you were optimistic about him heading into 2020, you may want to lower those expectations because it's probably going to be a headache just as it was in 2019.
Truth is, I'm not sure it's that great a thing to be a running back on the San Francisco 49ers with Kyle Shanahan calling the plays. I don't know that that's ever going to change there. It does seem like 3 and 4 back stables are going to be the norm in San Francisco for quite a while. And finally, Jim, let's talk about another great NFC running back who has been absolutely fantastic, but maybe due for a little regression. How about Aaron Jones in Green Bay? Rumors have maybe a cap casualty coming up. Some folks expecting maybe, maybe a step back this year. What are your thoughts about Aaron Jones and the Green Bay Packers moving forward?
Yeah, I like Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is a tremendous football player, as he showed last year, scoring a ton of touchdowns. I like this offense as well. So there are several good things that are still in Aaron Jones's favor. The issue I have with him is that there are changes on the offensive line, and Aaron Jones, his entire career in Green Bay, has been running behind one of the best offensive lines in all of football. But now Brian Bulaga, their right tackle, is gone. He is signed with the Los Angeles Chargers. They did sign Ricky Wagner from the Lions to replace him, but the Lions let Wagner go for a reason. That is a downgrade from Bulaga to Ricky Wagner. We should expect Aaron Jones' efficiency to decline as a result. But on top of that, they've already said that he's not going to be a bell cow next year. They have said they want to keep him fresh throughout the entire season, as they did last year, and mix in Jamal Williams. This is not a bad strategy by the Packers. You know, Jamal Williams was good enough last year to justify getting usage, and we've seen how much running backs can wear down in the NFL. So if you are a NFL team, it is in your best interest to potentially mix in guys, keep guys fresh. So I don't think the Packers are dumb for what they're doing, but it definitely does not help Aaron Jones from a fantasy perspective. He was due for regression in 2020 regardless because he scored so many touchdowns last year. That was not going to sustain in 2020, but now you take away Brian Bulaga, give them a downgrade at right tackle, and you bake in that regression, and things are probably not going to play out too well for Aaron Jones. Now, Jones is still a very good fantasy piece because he is tied to Aaron Rodgers. He himself is quite good, and the rest of that offensive line is still good as well. There are still a lot of great things working in Aaron Jones's favor, but given the year he's coming off of, given that we should expect him to come back to earth a bit next year, I think this is a good time to potentially sell him if you own him in dynasty leagues. And from a redraft perspective, take a long look at the other guys going around him and see what the expectations for them should be, because Aaron Jones potentially due to take a step back in 2020.
Yeah, I agree. You know, load management, not just in the NBA, but certainly might be playing a role with some of these running backs, especially Aaron Jones this year. Might be a little regression in the future. So you're right. Another team that will be very interesting to see what they do in the draft in the running back position. So, Jim, all in all, it has been an absolute crazy opening to the NFL free agency period. And you know, and I know, still plenty of big names on the board yet. Do you see this slowing down at all?
Oh, yeah. The NFL never sleeps. We've got a lot of quarterbacks could be on the move, and quarterbacks are the drivers of everything in fantasy football with the efficiency they bring to the table. So we're going to have plenty of more discussion about season-long winners and losers as we progress through this all season, but it's hard to tell how things will shake because this league has been definitely interesting the past couple of weeks.
It certainly has, and as usual, we've got you covered here on the FanDuel Hurry Up. And as these deals come in, we'll go ahead and break them down for you. So on behalf of Jim Sonis of numberFire, I'm Joe Ranieri. We'll be back again tomorrow with another edition of the FanDuel Hurry Up.